So I would like to introduce John Garbellano. This is a new type of program for us because most of everything, really, pretty much that we do is quote unquote new. This is not new. This is really old stuff. So I'm really excited about this. John works for Hartgen Archaeology Associates, with whom we've got quite a connection. They are very supportive of us. They've used to run our archaeology program. We love them. They're great people. And John's going to be talking, I've made some notes here. I don't want to jump too far ahead of him, but he's going to be talking about the peopling of the area from the last ice age to the present day, and what you can find even today that open up your eyes to some of the stories of the past. And he's going to concentrate on two sites that they've been working on. The one is in Malta, and then the other one is in Cambridge. So all this stuff is right on the doorstep, which makes it even more exciting and interesting. So, John, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you, everyone, for attending tonight's talk on regional archaeology of New York in the Champlain and Hudson Valley. And thank you to the Brookside Museum for hosting this program. It's an honor and privilege to be here today to represent Hartgen Archaeology and discuss archaeology. The peopling of the Champlain-Hudson Valley is an important and fascinating topic to me. It spans over 13,000 years. And for more than a century, anthropologists and other researchers have been studying the archaeological and environmental record of this area that's been used to define the people landscape of this region, which has given us really new and fresh glimpses of the past, human ecological relationships, and new interpretations that have challenged our views of ancient people's ingenuity, as well as the past. Here we can see the broad area that our teams work in throughout the Northeast, as well as examples of different kinds of tools and projectile points that can be found in this area. When you were walking in here today, you've noticed some of those laid out. It goes from oldest to most recent, from left to right. On the far left, we have Paleo-Indian tools in excess of 12,000 years old, all the way up to present tools, some that were made out of copper through trade that was done with early Europeans and settlers. I'd like to first also acknowledge that the Champlain and Hudson Valley are the traditional homelands of the Mohican, Munsee, Lenape, Mohawk, Haudenosaunee peoples, among others. These indigenous tribes and nations have stewarded this land for generations, maintaining a deep connection to its waters, forests, mountains, plants, and wildlife. We honor their enduring presence, resilience, and contributions, recognizing that we are guests on this territory, as well as the importance of maintaining good relations and communications during all our projects. So what is archaeology? Archaeology is a broad field that involves the study of the past through the material remains people have left behind. And like I was saying, New York State's archaeological resources represent 13,000 years of human history in this area. Equally important is the use of archaeology to provide indigenous descendants a better understanding of how their ancestors lived on the land and where their cultural resources are located. So when doing archaeology itself, you follow three steps to every archaeological investigation. The first is phase one, which is identification of the site. The second is phase two, which is evaluation of the site. And the third, which I'll be talking about more in depth later, is phase three, which is mitigation and data recovery. That's what Hartgen did at the two sites I'll be discussing in Malta and Cambridge. It was data recovery. And a lot of times going into work, archaeologists use a variety of methods. Here we see people screening soil for artifacts. And while you're actually doing work, you typically expect to find a broad variety of tools and materials, such as stone tools, things like scrapers that were used for cleaning hides, pottery, effigies, other ornamental pieces. Some really great stuff can be found while doing archaeology. For those who looked at the table coming in, I had examples of flakes, and even in the absence of amazing material like this, flakes, primary flakes, secondary flakes, and even later flakes, tertiary flakes that represent all different various steps of creating stone tools, those can still be found at sites. And in the absence of materials like this, they can tell a really powerful story about what people were doing, trade relations that they had, resources that they were acquiring, sometimes hundreds of kilometers away, and a little bit more about their ingenuity and adaptations and the technology that they had in their toolkits. Archaeology is important because it can yield key information about the region's past and peoples. There's all varieties of sites that can be found. Typically, you find the oldest things on the bottom-most layers when you're digging, and more recent things at the top. But in situations like in areas like here where there's a lot of plowing and fields and agriculture that have taken place, a lot of these things are commingled and have been turned up because of plowing. Here we see kind of a mosaic of sites. We have Dutchess Quarry Cave, which is an old Paleo-Indian site. We have hunter-gatherers on an Ice Age landscape, more settled villages, people fishing, Henry Hudson coming up the Hudson River and making first contact with peoples of this area. But when did people arrive here and how? What changes, if any, do we see in settlement patterns and adaptations? Where are archaeological sites located? What do people eat and do? These are some of the questions that archaeologists ask that I am asking and pursuing my own research. But before we go any further, we have a stop to make. And that stop is the Ice Age. So part of why I'm so fascinated by archaeology is the story of the peopling of the Americas, that ingenuity and process of people coming here, really determining how people came here, what corridors they came through from Beringia into the Americas down to the South America. And over the years, more and more evidence has come out showing where some of these movements took place. And archaeologists generally agree that several major shifts occurred. At the end of the last ice age, the environment as we see today was much different. Around 20,000 years ago, we would have been underneath more than a mile of ice. Here you see the Empire State Building, and that smaller building is the Cultural Education Center or the New York State Museum in Albany. It's dwarfs in comparison. You can also see the interior sea, the Lake Champlain Sea. For those who don't know, there used to be an interior sea in this part of North America. And for the most part, New Yorkers today would barely recognize the surrounding area when it was first inhabited by peoples over 13,000 years ago. But the best evidence that we have starts to show up in the Champlain and Hudson Valley around 13 to 12,000 years ago. It remains unclear exactly by what route the first humans reached the capital region, but two corridors seem most likely. One route is from the west, following both the Onondaga Escarpment and recently exposed shorelines of Glacial Lake Iroquois to the Mohawk River Valley. The second route is from the southwest, beginning in the Great Valley and continuing up the Delaware River Valley to the Wallkill Corridor and into the Mid-Hudson Valley, which is where I'm from. Here we see a map showing Paleo-Indian sites all throughout the Northeast around 13,000 years ago. You can also see just how far out the continental US used to go before rising sea levels. So there's actually around 100 kilometers or so of land that's inundated. So there's a lot of this big picture that we can't even see, and that it is possible to piece some of that together, but it's very difficult and requires underwater archaeology along with other methods. There's some instances where scallop fishermen have pulled up an actual mastodon head, and there was a Paleo-Indian fluted point in its skull. He couldn't find where that site was because he was trawling, but like a needle in a haystack, it can be done. But as I was saying, it's generally accepted that there were 5 major shifts in subsistence that have occurred over the last 13 millennia, or since the arrival of humans to this part of North America. From living around the river near the migration routes of caribou and other mammals at the end of the last ice age, around 13,000 to 10,000 years ago, people relocated their camps for greater proximity to backcountry wetland resources and glacial lake basins. This is the West Athens Hill site. I don't know if anyone's familiar, but it's one of the more well-known Paleo-Indian sites in New York State. And it was a quarry site, so people were coming here seeking materials to make stone tools and hunting caribou and other migratory animals. The first major shift, though, around 10,000 to 6,000 years ago, resulted in various regional adaptive diversification in glacial lake basins in the forests that had been established after the last ice age. Then again, around 6,000 to 3,000 years ago, a second shift occurred where settlement took on an even more widely dispersed pattern along interior streams for access to various game and nuts in the increasingly productive forests. During this shift in settlement, population also seems to have increased. Then gradually, around 3,000 to 1,500 years ago, a third shift occurred where people, and it's been argued that there were smaller populations, but people focused on floodplains to intensify small seed harvesting and begin cultivating domesticated plants. This is where we see initial interests in adaptations toward early horticulture. It's prior to full-on agriculture as we know it. But during this period, we see increased evidence for the intensification of seed procurement, and like I was saying, the inception of horticulture. Here we see a group of people, it looks like they're stowing a cache of stone tools for later use. They're probably passing through this area, but there's an open landscape behind them that they may have cleared in order to attract game or create a better environment for other plants and resources that they were using. Then in a relatively sudden fourth shift around 1,500 to 1,000 years ago, people located their camps on the Hudson River for its androgynous fish, and were focusing on fishing and collecting other resources in these riparian settings for around 500 years. Finally, a fifth shift occurred where certain groups dispersed more onto floodplains and set up more established villages, larger villages, population was bigger, and people had developed into full-blown agricultural societies. But in addition to the archaeological record, we also have Native American oral histories and firsthand accounts by early European settlers and immigrants that give us firsthand accounts and recollections of some of the ways that people were living on the landscape up to European contact. With all this in mind, let's begin to take a closer look at the location of 2 archaeological sites that I'll be talking about today. The questions we asked and unique stories that a small amount of archaeological evidence can provide. The Three Silos site in Malta, New York, which you may or may not be able to see on the map. There's a red star delineating where it's located. And the Cambridge Firehouse site in Cambridge, New York, they are two very unique pre-contact sites separated by about 25 miles. Both are situated along creeks and both tell very different stories regarding the activities of indigenous people before contact with Europeans. The Three Silos site overlooks Drummond Creek to the north. It is also located within the footprint of Saratoga Lake, Round Lake, and Boston Lake drainage basins, which are all part of the Greater Hudson River and Mohawk watersheds. The Cambridge Firehouse site is located within the Taconic Mountain region, which is characterized by hilly terrain underlined by the Taconic sequence, which is a fairly large mountain range that was formed about 400 million years ago, which exceeds, people were not here 400 million years ago. But still, nonetheless, it's cool if you like geology. And the Cambridge site is actually located along the White Creek. So these are two sites located along creeks. But what I'll start to discuss is how different activities were occurring there, and two different people were there at separate times. At both of these sites, though, some of the questions that were asked is what activities were performed at each site, how do these sites relate to other sites in the region, and can any conclusions be reached regarding the age of them? This is the location of the Three Silos site, which is, I put it into Google Maps before I got here. It's about 3.5 miles away from where we're standing right now. And work at Three Silos took place in 2020 in advance of the construction of a 58-unit development at the Three Silos Planned Development District. So that is an aerial shot of the Three Silos site. And I'll be talking largely about the concentration of artifacts that were found here and here. This is the location of the Cambridge Volunteer Firehouse. And this is another prehistoric site that was done in 2021. Research was done here in 2021 in advance of the construction of the town's new firehouse. So to address our questions about when people were here, what they were doing, how they relate to other sites in the area, archaeologists used a variety of methods for excavation, shovel testing, mechanical stripping to completely remove topsoil in fields, test unit excavation, feature excavation, which is all jargon, needless to say that different types of digging that can answer different questions. So with shovel testing, you go from very small to test unit excavation, very large. A 1 by 1 meter test unit is the typical dimension that we work within. Archaeologists use also different types of analysis, radiocarbon dating, residue analysis. We'll take soil samples and we'll do floral analysis, and we'll look at all the kinds of seeds and wood present in the soil to get a better idea of the environment of an area and some of the vegetative resources that people were using or the fuel that they were burning to cook food as well. Here we see Three Silos site. These are those two concentrations of artifacts I was referencing before. This is a heat map, which essentially shows the darker in color is the greater concentration of artifacts that were found during excavations. Here we see the area that was impacted stripped with backhoes. Imagine you're literally just shaving off the top 30 or 40 centimeters of soil. And then below that, you would find features of either hearths or tree burns on the surface. And once you identify those, archaeologists will go in with test unit excavation, excavate those features to see what type of material evidence there's in there. Is there charcoal? Are there projectile points or debitage, some of the materials you saw when you came in here? You can also see the type of environment that archaeologists work in. Typically, it's overgrown, high weeds, poison ivy, ticks, creepy crawlies. It's hot. Here they have some shade, fortunately. You can see here's a rocker screen, which you'll use in the field to shake, to find artifacts. If you just hold your question till the end, I'll get you. At Three Silos, most of the evidence that was recovered suggested that people were primarily at this site retooling their knives or projectile points. There was a limited amount of activities that they could have been doing based on the evidence that was found, but they were also making use of local materials. Here's a painting of Mount Marino. Some of the lithics and debitage that were recovered were sourced to Mount Marino, so they were using very localized resources. But they were also using material from other areas around Fort Anne. I believe one flake of Pennsylvania jasper was found on this site as well, which would have been traded all the way from Pennsylvania to here. Jasper does not occur naturally in New York or in small quantities. So that's very unique. It was also another really interesting finding was that most of the stone material that was found had evidence of heat treating. About 25% of all the debitage and flakes that were found had heat treating, which is evidence that people were actually intentionally controlling heat to create a better tool. So they would, and interestingly too, one flake was found discarded in a fire pit that was excavated. And what heat treating does is it improves workability. Another interesting discovery was evidence for fishing. On one of the recovered projectile points, residue analysis was completed, and there was evidence for either striped bass or trout, which suggests that people were at Three Silos near Drummond Creek fishing in the mid-spring to early summer months. So there's some seasonality that can be determined through residue analysis. No bones or anything, no faunal remains were found at this site, but I thought that was really cool. Several other interesting finds were several bifaces that had characteristics of being hafted. So here we see some of them. There's also retouched utilized flakes. With this projectile point, the blue arrow shows where the tip had been broken from impact most likely, and this red arrow shows where it fractured while it was hafted. So this is what a hafted projectile point would look like on a shaft, on an atlatl or an arrow or spear. And oftentimes you don't find that material evidence because it was made out of bone or wood, things that would decompose. In addition to evidence that tool repair was being done on site, a small quantity of fire-cracked rock was found, which suggests that at some point there were intact cooking platforms or fire pits or hearths on the site, but they were probably located near the ground surface, and over time, through extensive agricultural and farming in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, they were destroyed or disarticulated from their original provenience. So then you can see how plows have developed through time and how they more or less have become more destructive. But given the disturbance and the limited amount of artifacts that were and evidence that was recovered, it was difficult to conclude the specific activities that were going on here, or the extent of them at least. The few stone tools and complete projectile points that were recovered from both areas shared similar patterning for lithic reduction. That's why fairly confident people were at Drummond Creek fishing. They were creating expedient tools to process fish, cooking fish, probably going back to where their more sedentary camps were located. And part of that evidence is reinforced by that one projectile point that had residue on it for either striped bass or trout. So in here you can kind of almost imagine how if this was Drummond Creek and people were going to the creek and processing fish and catching fish. I'll get you at the end. Here we can also see Three Silos is located right here, and all of these other sites are prehistoric sites located in the area. So it was a fairly active area. People were attracted to the Saratoga Lake region and tributaries for their resources, and they kept coming back here over time. Onto the Cambridge site. The Cambridge site is another small but interesting pre-contact site located roughly 25 miles away in the village of Cambridge. The original project here entailed construction of the firehouse for the Cambridge Volunteer Fire Department, and it's located on a parcel of land that encompasses 2 terraces along White Creek. It's located in the Taconic Mountain region, which you can see here. And in this area, it's fairly hilly terrain. There are materials suitable for tool manufacture, but they're in low quality and not typically in massive form, so they're not easily exploited. But within this area, you have Fort Ann Chert and other quarries not too far away that people were likely going to and accessing stone resources from. And again, most of the terrain in this area was shaped and formed since the last ice age. If you can almost imagine 1.5 miles of ice over this landscape, and then as it melted, it virtually scarred the landscape and made it look like how it looks today. Here is the volunteer firehouse. Plans for this firehouse included, obviously, a new structure, a new firehouse, paved access for parking, sidewalks, utilities, and landscaping. So a fairly comprehensive and amount of things that needed to be done, a large area that was being impacted. So the size of the area was fairly large in terms of excavations, but not a lot of material was found. And similar to Three Silos, methods such as plow zone stripping were done, surface finds were collected, test units were excavated on features, and we used carbon dating and other forms of analysis to explain and interpret as much of the site as possible. Here you can see the area itself that was stripped. 5 areas were stripped in total. And within those areas, various features were found. Don't get caught up too much in the search areas themselves, but here is an example of what some of those features looked like, which weren't typically characteristic of hearths or roasting platforms. Some of them, were either rodent burrows or they were from intentional tree burns. I'll get into that soon. A total of 63 features were found, but of those 63 features, 27 were excavated. And these features fell into three categories primarily: burn features with intact charcoal deposits and reddened soil, possible post molds, and patches of fire reddened earth that lacked charcoal. Archaeologists focused on the first two of these categories, as it was felt that reddened subsoil features were unlikely to contain artifacts and provided useful samples due to their ephemeral nature. So, process of elimination: what looks like it's going to give us the best evidence, what looks most like a hearth, and let's focus on that essentially. From the start, it was clear that very few of the features were producing cultural material, though. Some of the features produced small numbers of flakes. Most produced no artifacts, though. Especially striking was the lack of fire-cracked rock in most burn features. And as I was saying, most of the features were inconsistent with typical archaeological features that suggest human activity. But of all the features identified, several were determined to be intentional. This included 2 roasting platforms, 1 hearth, and 1 pulse mold. Here you can see on the left is a hearth feature, and directly below that, after that feature was excavated, a roasting platform was found, which is pretty unique. Right on top of each other. So, and within those features, more was realized. The presence of fire-cracked rock on the arc of rock and the concentration of charcoal suggests people were cooking. And residue analysis actually showed that people were likely cooking some type of meat. The remaining burn features were likely related to other cultural activities, such as burning vegetation to clear for agriculture, which was done to promote the growth of certain useful plants or to attract game. And this is interesting because if this is the case, it's a notable find, an example of human environmental interactions and human ingenuity. And it's been highly debated over the last century, the long-standing and mostly pre-20th century myth of Europeans coming here and seeing this Garden of Eden that was untouched by peoples and just had vast, limitless resources. Has been disproven, obviously. Studies throughout the 20th century provided evidence that indigenous peoples were intentionally modifying their landscape to promote things like horticulture and agriculture, and create suitable conditions for hunting and the use of various plants and animals. The evidence at the Cambridge site could fit that pattern, being that it's in the territory of the Mohicans, who lived in fairly settled villages along the rivers of this area. So here's just some visuals of potential prehistoric controlled burns. And in addition to all these burn features, some evidence was recovered that indicated other activities were taking place here. A partially reworked projectile point, a possible Brewerton side notch point, which dates to the late Archaic. There were some examples of that located in the front, which I can show you as you leave today. There's also several unfinished bifaces were found on the top right. All the way to the right is a fragment of a biface. And on the bottom left, we have scrapers, end scrapers, which would have been utilized to clean hides or process bone or wood. And although few stone tools were found, there was a little bit of debitage and fire-cracked rock that was found. The debitage that was found indicates that people, similar to three silos, were primarily reworking tools, repairing them. They weren't coming to here with lots of cores or larger stone that had been sourced from outcrops to make tools. They were primarily using what they had in hunting. In addition to these features and tools that were recovered, we also did radiocarbon dating, which is really important because it helps fit everything into nice, tight chronology. On the floodplain, most of the material was dated to the late woodland up to contact period, so from around 1492 to 1602. And then on the outwash terrace, we have dates for the late Archaic, so in excess of 4,000 years ago. So here we have peoples from the late Archaic were active on the outwash terrace, and they were most likely hunting game, maybe doing some controlled burns to open up the area for game to wander in. And on the floodplain, people were doing controlled burns to promote agriculture. This was during the late woodland. People were no longer hunting and gathering. They were hunting and gathering, but they were more focused on agriculture at this point. So down in the floodplain is where the most fertile soil is going to be, the rich soil that's going to be the best for growing certain crops, right? And we're not done yet. We took it a step further. So on top of radiocarbon dating, on top of the material evidence and stone tools that were found, this research was taken a step further. Floral and residue analysis was done to determine what exactly may have been going on with the hearth and roasting platform. So soil samples were submitted for analysis. In the roasting platform, charcoal was submitted, and that was found in the hearth, and it was identified as alder, hornbeam, hickory, pine, spruce, hemlock, willow, and basswood, which are all found in the area. So these were the types of woods that they were using for fires. There was also fatty residue in the roasting platform that suggested some type of meat was being cooked. Analysis of charcoal from the hearth identified pine and willow. Charred raspberry and blackberry seeds were also identified, which is interesting and could indicate that raspberries were being processed during the late Archaic by peoples for food or medicinal reasons, probably. But they could also result from controlled field burnings. If there was wild raspberries in the field in the late woodland period, peoples were doing a controlled burn. That could also be evidence of that. Overall, the evidence recovered at both sites showed people were at Cambridge, showed people were attracted to this area at different times and for different reasons. So we have one group of people during the late Archaic who were most likely there hunting and gathering, and then you have a second group of people who were there during the woodland period who were more focused on agricultural subsistence. And then around approximately 25 miles away at the Three Silo site, there's evidence of people from the middle to late woodland periods who are also making use of local materials. Here they were making use of Mount Marino chert and other local quarries. Similar to Cambridge, there was late stage tool production and tool reshaping taking place here. But at Three Silos, unlike Cambridge, the evidence suggests that they were primarily focused on fishing in Drummond Creek, and the people were coming to that area in the mid-spring to early summer to fish. They weren't bringing a big toolkit with them, probably expedient tools in terms of flakes and knives or other tools like that to catch and process fish. And although no concrete connection can be made between Three Silos and the Cambridge Firehouse site and other sites in the area, it is clear there is a pattern of people living on similar landscapes and making use of similar resources, using their own ingenuity and adaptations. Both of these sites are part of a large and complex archaeological record, evidencing the movements and activities of people since the end of the last ice age up to European contact. And the evidence found at both sites shows a strong connection and familiarity with the land and resources. Why it all matters. All of this matters because the Champlain and Hudson Valley contain a long and diverse record of human history spanning over 13,000 years. And despite very little archaeological evidence at both of these sites, the evidence that was looked at offers pretty compelling stories of how people lived in the past. The evidence that was recovered was unique and shows that it does not take large sites or thousands of artifacts to study or add to the history of this region. At both of those sites, only several hundred flakes and a few completed projectile points were found. No bone was found or pottery or anything like that. It was fairly limited. Additionally, archaeology and cultural resource management, which is what Hartgen specializes in, are key services for preserving, documenting, and studying this long period of human history and filling in gaps of our knowledge and understanding about human ingenuity, relationships with the environment and other people. Archaeology can also provide indigenous descendants a better understanding of how their ancestors lived on the land, when and where. This is especially important when areas are being developed and changed for housing, roads, and other infrastructure, or damaged and lost because of looting or rising sea levels. Equally important is the chance to give talks to communities about the history of this area and discuss evidence that gives us clues about this dynamic relationship people have had for over 13,000 years with this region. But overall, research and talks like this add to the history of the area, but in many ways are just scratching the surface when it comes to the study of people and places in this region. New York State also has a really great legacy when it comes to archaeology. Here we see some of the state's first archaeologists and people who conducted research in this area. I'll go from left to right. On the far left, we have Arthur C. Parker, who was New York State's first archaeologist. He was responsible for the collection and accessioning of most of the state's resources. Then we have William A. Ritchie, who was another state archaeologist in the 30s and 40s. He identified a lot of the typologies that are used to identify projectile points and arrowheads in this area. His book is actually on the table out front. Next, we have Mary Butler Lewis, who is one of my favorite archaeologists. She completed one of the first surveys of the Hudson River, and she was also the first woman to earn a PhD in anthropology from the University of Pennsylvania. She also taught at Vassar College, and her research is what I'm most closely following, along with Lou Brennan's, who I'll get to in a moment. Robert E. Funk was another state archaeologist and succeeded Lou Brennan. He and William Ritchie Robert, Funk, and Ritchie primarily worked in Western New York, although they did work at several sites in this part of the Hudson Valley and Champlain Valley. And then there's Lou Brennan, who was an avocational archaeologist. He did not go to school for archaeology, but he ended up doing a lot of research in the lower Hudson Valley on shell middens. He utilized radiocarbon dating when it first came out to date sites along the Hudson River. And he's credited for dating one of the oldest shell midden sites in this side of North America along the Atlantic coast. So to some extent, I'm following the work of all these individuals, among other archaeologists. These archaeologists all did their work in the 20th century. And not too much research has been done or focused on the sites that they have studied. So that's another reason why archaeology and all of this matters. We need more people out there doing research. I find the study of archaeology in this area really fascinating because of the larger story of the peopling of this part of North America, how people got here, when they got here, through which routes they took. People first started to come into the Americas around 12,000, 13,000 years ago on the East Coast. Even further back, there's evidence that suggests people were here as early as 15,000 years ago. Evidence in South America at the Monteverde site. I'm from the area as well. I grew up in Dutchess County too. So the Hudson River Valley in this area, very familiar with me. Here we see a broad variety of sites all throughout the Hudson Valley. Lake George is all the way up here. So we are more or less located right around here, I believe. And there's a mix of sites from Paleo-Indian all the way up to woodland. So here you can kind of see a mosaic of sites from different periods, which indicates people were very familiar with the area and we're actually going back to similar areas throughout time. But my research is primarily focused on the study of shell middens and the earliest evidence of shell fishing along the Hudson River estuary. Here I am pictured on the bank of the Hudson River at a site that Lou Brennan studied. He was one of the archaeologists I mentioned earlier. And Mary Butler had also done research in this area along the Hudson River estuary with high schoolers and first-year students at Vassar College in the 40s, 1940 and 41. And what's really interesting about Dogan Point is that it's one of the earliest shell middens. For those who don't know what a shell midden is, it's essentially a big pile of shells that people had discarded over potentially hundreds of years of time. And they act as time capsules for multiple reasons, which I can get into later, but they preserve artifacts really well. So you can even find some of the material that you don't find in sites and farmland because the soil is acidic and it decomposes bone and other things. You can find those at shell middens because the calcium creates more of a neutral soil, so things don't deteriorate as quickly because they're less acidic. This is also shows how the Hudson River has changed through time. Sea level has risen and to near modern levels around 3,000 years ago. But as far back as 7,000 years ago, there was much more land that was exposed. So for me, this research is interesting because it adds elements of climate change. People were utilizing resources in a very dynamic environment. And there's evidence of trade throughout the entire Hudson Valley, all across the Hudson River. So that red star shows approximately where Dogan Point is located. For those who can just imagine the Hudson River in your mind, this is the widest part in Haverstraw Bay down in Westchester County. From here, it's about a 2.5-hour drive. And the Hudson River is actually estuarine all the way up to Troy. So there are tides that change twice a day, I believe. Here you can also see how much the landscape changed from around 9,000 years ago all the way up to present times. Sea level rose around a meter every 1,000 years. So when Middle and Early Archaic people were here, much more of the site was exposed. And after more meltwater subsided and rising sea levels slowed down, more of the site was lost. But with that too, created a way more diverse area and ecosystem for people to live in and interact with. You can see the development of wetlands here, which would have had different resources for people to utilize. You can also see how much of the site has been lost and inundated. The site is also at risk for erosion. Most of the site is quite literally being absorbed by the Hudson River. Here's just several photos of my field work. And here's a good example of what a shell midden looks like. There's millions of shells at this site. And this just shows it eroding more or less. From here, I'm facing south towards Manhattan. In the background is Hook Mountain. From Hook Mountain, on a clear day, you can see the skyline of New York City. So you're right there. There's also evidence that there are oyster reefs still in the Hudson River that are as old as 6,000 years old. So someday, if I have a big NSF grant, we're going to do big research down there, underwater archaeology. But ultimately, archaeology is really fascinating to me because it's like putting pieces of a puzzle together and you with all the pieces that you can amass, you create some picture, right? There might be gaps in the picture, but as long as you have enough evidence, you can kind of get a basic idea of what the image is there. And it's up to us as archaeologists to piece this puzzle together and do so in an ethically and transparent way. Some of my stuff got cut off, but that's it. I'll go back to anything you guys want to see. Thank you for coming, guys. Appreciate it. Thank you.